Well, it has told them, and I thought it's a bit like the British public that we have David Cameron at the moment, who is clearly destroying the country, and we're going to come on to some of these things, and we get exactly the same response, that here we have Cameron and the Tories absolutely ripping this country apart, whether we like it or not. So do we think he's a
consistent.
jinx? Do we think he's a jinx?
Well,
I rather think he is, actually.
I'd like to refrain from saying what I think he is, but
okay.
he, well, it's consistent, isn't it?
He's consistent, and we're going to talk about some of the things going on in the background now. So
yeah, I'd just like to touch on one article I found on Press TV last night. It was revelations by a Dutch journalist who was held captive by anti-Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Armed groups in the country show the terrorists are not Syrian people, as Western governments claim, and are rather foreign elements. I can't pronounce his name. Mr. Orlemans and a British journalist, John Cantley, were released on Thursday after being held by a group of Free Syrian Army members for a week. The Dutch journalist told the media after their release that some of the 30 to 100 strong Free Syrian Army gang who arrested him and his colleague while crossing the border from southeast Turkey near their camp had Birmingham accents. The gang comprised at least 6 people with British accents, including one with a heavy South London speech tone, and this was all reported in the Sunday Telegraph. So here we are again, a bit like the reports coming out of Libya, that many of the rebels who were standing up against Gaddafi were not Libyan people. Here we have practically the same story now we're hearing in Syria.
Yeah, well, it's the minimum we can say is, of course, that the British mainstream media are just not reporting the truth about what's happening in Syria, and I don't think they did in Libya. If we look at it in simple terms, we can't have it both ways. If we've got a threat identified, which is what the British and the world media say, which is a group called Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda are very dangerous and are responsible for everything from the Twin Towers to problems in Afghanistan, then how can the British government be supporting the operation of such groups in their attacks on Syria and within Syria?
Exactly.
Or is it the case that actually these terrorist groups contain British elements, because it's actually this country which is stirring up the problem for President Assad?
Exactly. We also said here that reports said that no Syrians were present in the terrorist camp, where almost 40% spoke English, while others were from Pakistan, Bangladesh and Chechnya.
Yeah.
So they weren't actually, so these are the people that, to us, the British people, while we're sitting watching the BBC, that it's the Syrian people uprising against Assad. And here we have British journalists coming out to say not one of those people was Syrian.
Well, the other thing we can point out here is, well, if we quote the Dutch, or we indicate the Dutch journalist here, that the sources of this counter-argument as to what's actually going on in Syria is as good as anything that the BBC is putting forward at the moment, because we know that the BBC is quoting unknown so-called Syrian freedom groups and giving their opinion in what's happening in the country. But here we are seeing other journalists, respected national journalists, who are giving a totally different view of who is causing the trouble. Yeah. And I find it interesting that President Assad said very early on, and has continued to say, that the escalating trouble and violence in Syria is being fueled and controlled by foreign agencies. And we already know from sources that are prepared to talk to the UK column that these include special forces coming from Britain. Yeah. So something very nasty is going on in Syria at the moment. And not only are we not seeing it in the mainstream press, it's being overshadowed by the Olympics.
Of course.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think we're going to stick with this theme. Was there anything else on that?
No, that was really it. It's just it's just the same as what we were hearing coming out of Libya, really, and that's what I just wanted to highlight.
But what we're seeing on the news programmes, and the BBC was at it again last night, is that it's always portrayed that the moment there's any horrific violence, and we're seeing bodies and children injured and blood on the streets in Syria, the photographs are always shown claiming that this is the result of Syrian armed forces, with absolutely nothing put in a counter view as to what these people. And I know in the article in front of you, the spokesman for that freedom fighting group is boasting of their expertise with improvised explosive devices and the placing of explosives.
Yeah, and the British Foreign Office actually announced that they're going to investigate the presence of British nationals among the anti-Assad gangs.
Yeah. So, well, we will keep an eye on what's happening there, but we would say that at the moment the truth is not being told over what's really happening in Syria.
Nope.
Well, we've got another, I've messed it up now, we've got another story surfacing, which is Trident. You discovered this one.
I did last night in The Guardian, that Lockheed Martin and Babcock are going to be looking after the day-to-day running of Trident, the nuclear missile submarine base.
Yeah.
Which is, again, more private security firms taking something which this is a nuclear, and they're going to be looking after the day-to-day running of Trident, which is quite a big concern, I think.
I think it's huge concern. What's very interesting about this story is background, which is there, but it's time has passed, so people are not really joining the pieces together. But if we go back a bit, just prior to the last election, there were huge events taking place unseen to the British public around our defence and the Strategic Defence Review. And it was the UK column that broke the story that decisions were being taken with respect to our strategic defence and those decisions in private meetings by the Franco-British Council, which is actually a charity. We showed and we printed details of meetings that had taken place where at the ambassador's residence in Paris, under the hand of the Franco-British Council, people both from senior level of British and French governments and the military from both Britain and France were sitting down to talk about plans for joint defence agreements. Now, these weren't being done as part of open government discussions where there's some accountability. These were done behind closed doors. But it's highly significant, I think, that the moment Cameron was in power, he's announcing a 50-year defence partnership with the French. Now, this actually becomes more significant when we look at the way that France at the moment is being given an open door to the British nuclear industry. So what the UK column was warning at the time, and we're talking several years ago now, was the fact that our military was slowly being locked in alongside the French. Now, it's very interesting here that without any proper debate in Parliament, we've seen no serious questioning of the Defence Minister or Cameron. We are giving away control of British nuclear deterrent, control in as much as if the submarines can't function and go to sea, you've lost control of your nuclear deterrent. I understand, of course, that the military and the government have final operational control, but the point remains that if the servicing and maintenance and upkeep and training of those vessels is not done properly, then our independent nuclear deterrent is undermined. And now, without any debate in Parliament, we are handing control across to these huge companies. Now, this has come through the atomic weapons establishment, which has already got a long-standing agreement with the government, but now we're giving a 15-year agreement with a range of other companies. And just so that it's reported, we've got Jacobs Engineering, essentially American-based, Lockheed Martin, American-based.
They did the sensors and their arms manufacturers, aren't they, Lockheed Martin?
Huge international arms manufacturers. Yeah. And we've also, of course, got Serco, And Serco is a company which is reported on the internet as being the biggest company that you have never heard of. And we're seeing Serco controlling at the moment UK borders, working within our hospitals, controlling prisons, and now with a huge foot into the aspect of nuclear weapons.
It's dangerous.
So,
ground.
yeah, one of the papers actually said here, it described them as ambitious and controversial outsourcing plans. Now that, of course, is an understatement, because what we're dealing with here is Britain's nuclear deterrent, and we are seeing control, physical control, being put in the hand of private companies who are totally unaccountable to the taxpayer.
Yeah? Just like G4S?
Just like G4S. The other thing I think we should mention here is that, of course, what's happening should also be seen against the background of the push for independence for Scotland. And we could end up in the situation shortly where not only does the British government and a normal naval-based system, so the public sector has lost control of what's happening to these submarines, we've now also got them sitting in their bases within what will have become an independent country, which presumably under Mr. Salmon would have totally different views on whether nuclear weapons should or should not be used at all.
Yeah.
So I know some people out there will be thinking, well, why do we need the nuclear weapons? But I think as far as this little report goes, we need to focus on what the public are being told and what they're not being told.
Absolutely.
But I think this is very dangerous.
Very, very dangerous, I agree.
Yeah.
So your bit now.
Well, the other thing which surprisingly has emerged while the Olympics is on is the fact that today Mr. Justice Ryder is going to announce his final report on the family courts. And there has been a little bit of this in the mainstream media, but I think our argument would be that we're not seeing the subject discussed in depth. So the view that's being put across by the BBC and mainstream newspapers is that we have problems in the family courts at the moment because they are not fast enough, because it may take 2 years or more in order for the courts to make decisions about children. The argument is that this is adversely affecting the children, and we need to speed the whole process up. In fact, if we talk to people who are using the family courts, and the statistics which have been made available in the press are that the state is now taking a child every 22 minutes. What Mr. Justice Ryder is actually doing is speeding up the ability of the court to handle children. I'm using that word deliberately. And also he's closing the courts down. So whilst the public are being told that family courts are to be made more open, if you actually follow through what Justice Ryder is doing, he is actually making it more difficult for people who are trying to protect their children in the courts, because he is limiting the ability of people to act as a litigant in person. So I know that since you've been with us at the UK column, you're aware of the number of emails that we're getting and what people are saying. The key bit here is that Justice Ryder is basically pushing that judges will adopt a more inquisitorial approach within the court system, and this is going to be limiting the ability of the parties, so that's mothers and fathers on one side, local authorities on the other in child protection cases. His view, Mr. Ryder's views are going to be limiting the ability of people to actually act as a litigant in person and question parties as to what's happening with the children. And the bit I'm going to keep stressing for viewers, of course, in these family courts, there are no juries, and so nobody can actually see justice being done properly. There's no public, there's no juries, and Justice Ryder, as a judge, is now recommending that judges are given even more power to make the decisions.
So quickly, Brian, just for people out there, so if somebody gets called into a family court with regards to their children, nobody could go in, it's just the parents are allowed to go into the court and social services and obviously the judge.
Well,
is that right?
Usually families will go in with a solicitor or a barrister,
Okay.
if they can afford that. But of course we're seeing legal aid stripped away from
Absolutely.
families. But what has also been happening, certainly over the last 2 years, is that because more and more mums and dads realise that they cannot trust, I'm sorry if you're a member of the legal profession, because you might be upset what I'm about to say, but we have seen case after case, hundreds of cases, where people are saying that they cannot trust their legal teams to take full instructions from them, or they're seeing their legal teams doing deals behind their backs with the local authority, that more and more families are actually conducting cases for themselves as litigants in person, or they're taking in another lay member of the public to work with them as an advisor, as a so-called Mackenzie's friend.
Right.
But the disadvantage with the Mackenzie's friend system is that even if you are a highly knowledgeable and capable person, you know the law, you know how the courts work, the Mackenzie's friend rules do not allow the Mackenzie's friend to speak for the mum or the dad, and they also do not allow the Mackenzie's friend to actually question somebody. So there are already extremely onerous restrictions being placed on the use of lay people in the court. And of course, if the judge is now is able to act as I nearly said the Spanish Inquisition, but they are being able to put more and more questions forward, these courts are becoming more introverted. Absolutely. And more closed, not more open. So, I mean, we've had John Hemming MP, who's actually been speaking out on the courts for a number of years, and Mr. Hemming was prepared to say on stage with the UK column that in his view the family courts were utterly corrupt, and that Lord Justice Wall, head of the Family Law Division, should stand down. So against that background, what Mr. Ryder is talking about is nothing to do with solving the corruption in the court. It's simply with making the courts even more secretive and difficult for ordinary people to handle. I've got a little bit here, if I can just find it, which I think we should mention. And this is that the UK column was recently sent some material to do with a family court case, which was particularly unpleasant. Of course, the restrictions mean that I can't mention the names of individuals connected. But I was provided with documentation which was passing between Mr. Janogly, who's the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Justice, and Mr. Greg Mulholland MP. And basically, in Mr. Janogly's reply to Mr. Mulholland, he was commenting on the fact that we didn't have juries in these family courts. I'll keep an eye on the time. Now, in an email sent to Mr. Janogly by the UK column, we were talking about what we had experienced ourselves in the courts. And I'd said, my personal experiences to date have shown court systems riddled with lies, false reports such as psychiatric reports, false testimony, perjury and more. We receive calls from 5 to 6 parents each week with template stories of abuses by the system, the most tragic having their children stolen by the state. And I pointed out that John Hemming MP and Christopher Booker from the Daily Telegraph are two people who are actually speaking out. Yeah. And then in his letter to Mr. Mulholland, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Justice, Mr. Janogly, says that issues involving a mixture of fact and law are not ones for which a jury trial has been considered suitable. So I pointed out to him that essentially this is amazing arrogance that this MP is saying, well, basically we don't consider that ordinary people can handle the issues of a family court. And yet this is remarkable in that a jury might be required to sit over a serious rape case or assault or to deal with fraud and corruption. That's why we have juries. But this is the arrogance that we're dealing with, that this minister is suggesting that the ordinary person is not bright enough to sit in a jury. And there's another part to this, because to date, Mr. Janogly has refused to answer this email, and the UK column questions have been passed through to the Ministry of Justice, where they've been answered by a lady who calls herself a policy officer. And what we've discovered is that within the Ministry of Justice we now have teams of people who are simply there to deal with complaints, and they talk about policy, not justice. So there are many people at the moment who believe that what judges are doing in the courts is not making decisions over what is fair, what's truth, what's justice. They are simply pushing across government policy. So we would like to say to viewers, please keep your eye on this. Have a look at what Mr. Ryder is saying, but think what's really there behind it.
Super. Now, okay. Deutsche Bank. Is it Deutsche Bank?
Deutsche Bank.
Yeah.
Well, we've decided to just introduce this into the programme. There's a little bit of water left in there, if that would help. We know that at the moment all of the mainstream and international banks are under pressure. But there was a little report, I'm not quite sure which paper it came from, but Deutsche Bank is reporting a slump of 46% in its second quarter earnings. And the bank is obviously desperately worried that it's seen profits dropping from 963 million down to 516 million. Now, of course, what do banks do for their money? Well, they don't do anything. They simply charge interest on the money that's loaned. That's about the nub of it. But Deutsche Bank, of course, is one of the key funders for the political charity Common Purpose. And I find it very interesting that a few months after Common Purpose has had to take personal loans from its own trustees in order to keep it operating, I think the loans are in the order of £300,000. Deutsche Bank, which is one of the big foreign banks which is funding Common Purpose's activities in Britain, is now seeing its own profits slump. Yeah. So we are definitely now seeing more evidence coming up to the surface of big pressure in the financial system. And perhaps if Deutsche Bank's under pressure, they might consider stopping their donations to Common Purpose, which is interfering in German interference in British politics. Okay.
Germany again.
Well, we've got 2 minutes.
Yep. 2 minutes.
We need to mention the
shout box. Yeah, we've got the shout box, haven't we? That's just started. We've Mike set up for us, just like a chat box. So if anybody wants to put the comments in throughout the show, just go to the column website, and is there a tab, Mike, for the shout box?
Just below the player.
Just below the player. So that's there. Tomorrow, Malcolm will be in.
Yep.
Tomorrow doing the show.
Malcolm's coming in tomorrow, and we are going to be working hard on getting into issues to do with farming.
Yep.
And we're getting a very, very good response from people who are already passing us information that they've been desperate to get out. So if you're out there sitting on a farm animal or vaccination or dip type story, foot and mouth, please send us information that you've got, because we're compiling that. So I think that's going to be very good.
Very good. Well, thanks very much for tuning in today, and Malcolm will be in tomorrow with Brian from 12. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.